There is a file that was never supposed to be found, and the person who sealed it made absolutely sure of that, because whatever is inside it, whatever those 3 documents describe, someone decided a long time ago that the rest of us were better off not knowing. I found it in a university archive basement, in a box that had been sitting on a shelf between a broken projector and a stack of flood-damaged ledgers from a government department that no longer exists. The box had no label, just a strip of old tape across the lid with 2 words written in black marker, faded but still readable. Restricted, not for reproduction. No date, no signature, no explanation for why it was there, who put it there, or how long it had been sitting in that particular dark corner of that particular room. I almost walked past it. I wish I had. The air down there smelled like old paper and something underneath that, something mineral and faintly damp. The kind of smell that gets into your throat and stays there. The fluorescent light above me buzzed at a frequency that made the back of my teeth ache. I had been down in that basement for about 4 hours, working through a collection of environmental survey records for a research project that had nothing to do with any of this. Nothing to do with lake systems or government expeditions or creatures that have no name in any scientific catalog. I was looking for irrigation data from the 1980s. I found something else entirely. When I pulled the tape off and opened the box, the first thing I noticed was how deliberately it had been packed. This was not a box of forgotten paperwork that someone had shoved into storage and stopped thinking about. The 3 items inside were wrapped separately, each in a layer of brown paper, each with a small paper label attached. The labels were typed, not handwritten. Whoever prepared this box had access to a typewriter and enough time and intention to label each item individually before sealing the whole thing and putting it somewhere no one was supposed to look. That detail bothered me more than anything else I found that day, because forgotten things are not wrapped carefully. Forgotten things are just dropped. This was not forgotten. This was placed. The first item was a typed field report, 8 pages, submitted by a government survey director named James Calloway. The second was a handwritten account, 4 pages, from a local guide who had worked the channel system his entire life, a man named Samuel, transcribed by a clerk whose name appears on that document and nowhere else in any file I could locate in that archive. Not before it, not after it. Just that one transcription. That one afternoon, and then nothing. Like the clerk stepped through a door that closed behind him. The third item was a personal letter, 3 pages, handwritten, addressed to a colleague at a natural history institution, a woman named Dr. Margaret Hale. The envelope was sealed. It had never been posted. It was found, according to a note paper-clipped to the outside of the brown paper wrapping, folded inside the lining of Calloway's field jacket, which his daughter had donated to the archive years after his death, along with the rest of his personal effects, believing, the note said, that they might be of historical interest to someone. She had no idea. What I want you to understand before I go any further is what kind of man James Calloway was, because it matters enormously. It changes everything about what these documents mean. If this had been filed by someone with a reputation for exaggeration, someone known for dramatic storytelling or loose interpretation of evidence, you could put it down and move on. But Calloway spent over 2 decades as a government survey director. His professional record is immaculate. He was the kind of man who filed corrections to his own reports when he caught a rounding error 2 weeks after submission. His supervisor's assessment, written the year before the expedition, describes him as a man constitutionally incapable of stating more than the evidence strictly supports. That is the highest compliment that world knows how to give. And that man, that precise, careful, evidence-bound man, came back from a 22-day lake survey and wrote 3 separate documents describing something that has no place in any scientific framework he had spent his career operating inside of. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole point. I sat on the floor of that basement with those 3 documents in my lap for a long time before I did anything else. The fluorescent light kept buzzing. The mineral smell stayed in my throat, and I kept thinking about the box, about the tape, about the way each item had been wrapped and labeled with such deliberate care by someone who clearly did not want this information destroyed, but also clearly did not want it found. There is a very specific kind of fear that produces that behavior. Not panic, not denial. Something quieter and more considered than either of those. The fear of a person who has thought carefully about what they know and decided that the honest thing to do, the only honest thing, is to make sure it exists somewhere, even if that somewhere is a box in a basement with no label, even if the only person who ever opens it is a researcher looking for irrigation data who almost walked straight past it. Here is what was in those documents, and I want you to stay with me, because this is the kind of story that asks something of you as you listen. It asks you to hold 2 things at once. The first is your reasonable skepticism. You should keep that. It belongs to you. The second is the fact that a meticulous, methodical, professionally skeptical man encountered something in a remote lake system and could not account for it using any tool his career had given him. Both of those things are true at the same time. That tension is exactly where this story lives. If you want to hear the rest, stay with me. And if this is the kind of story that finds you the way it found me, share it with someone. Subscribe, leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. And I think more people need to hear what James Calloway wrote down and never sent to anyone. The survey was never supposed to be remarkable. That is almost always how it starts. The official project brief was straightforward. A government environmental agency had contracted a team to map a chain of inland lake channels feeding a larger watershed in a remote region. The channels had been partially surveyed years earlier, but the data was incomplete and outdated. The goal was to update the hydrological record, assess water flow patterns, document shoreline vegetation, and produce a set of usable maps. Routine work. The kind of project that gets approved in a weekly meeting and forgotten about until the final report lands on someone's desk. 8 people on the team. James Calloway as director. His field assistant, David Nicosi, who had worked with Calloway on 3 previous surveys and was, by every account, steady and observant and not given to invention. A botanist named Ruth Ellery, brought along for the vegetation documentation component. 4 government contractors handling equipment and logistics. And 1 local guide, a fisherman named Samuel, who had been recommended by the regional liaison office, with a note in the margin that read, in Calloway's own handwriting, "The only person in the region who knows where these channels actually go, as opposed to where the maps say they go." 12 days budgeted. Enough supplies for 14, just in case. They were out there for 22. The first 4 days went exactly as planned, and Calloway's field notes from that period read like what they are: careful, professional observations with no indication that anything unusual was coming. Water temperature readings, vegetation samples, depth measurements, channel width notations, the kind of data that fills government reports and gets cited in footnotes and never gets read by anyone outside the specific agency that commissioned it. But buried inside David Nicosi's handwritten account, recorded weeks later, under circumstances the file does not fully explain, there is a detail from those first 4 days that Calloway's official notes do not contain. On the morning of their departure, before anyone else had arrived at the launch point, Samuel spent nearly an hour standing alone at the water's edge, not checking equipment, not preparing the boat, just standing there, very still, looking at the water. When Nicosi arrived and asked what he was doing, Samuel said he was checking the season. Nicosi asked what that meant. Samuel said, and this is the transcription, this is exactly how Nicosi recorded it later: "There are months when you use this water, and months when the water is using you." Nicosi noted that he laughed when Samuel said it. He noted that Samuel did not laugh back. And then the rest of the team arrived, and the boats were loaded, and they pushed off into the channel, and nobody brought it up again. They had a schedule. They had a brief. They had 12 days of work to get through. Whatever Samuel meant, it could wait. It could not wait. Samuel stopped the boat on day 5, and nobody asked him to. There was no navigation hazard, no shallow water, no debris across the channel. He just cut the engine, set the paddle flat across his knees, and went still in a way that was different from the stillness of a man resting. It was the stillness of a man listening to something the rest of them could not hear. Calloway's official report describes this moment as an unscheduled navigation pause of approximately 8 minutes. Cause undetermined. 8 minutes. I want you to sit with that. 8 minutes of complete silence on open water, with a man who would not explain why he had stopped, staring at a wide, glassy basin ahead of them that the map showed as a standard channel widening, and nothing more. 8 minutes before Samuel picked the paddle back up, restarted the engine at its lowest possible setting, and steered them around the outer edge of the basin without crossing it. He added nearly 40 minutes to their travel time that day. Calloway noted this in his official report as a navigational deviation. He did not note that not one person on that boat said a single word for the entire 40 minutes it took to go around. The basin itself looked wrong in a way that was hard to pin down, and Cozy describes it in his account as too quiet. And I know how that sounds. Water is quiet. That is not unusual, but he is specific about what he means. Every other stretch of channel they had traveled made sound. Small sounds, the knock of reeds against the hull, the occasional bird, the low pull of current. This basin made none of those sounds. The reeds at its edges did not move, even though there was a steady wind pushing across the open water everywhere else. The surface was flat in a way that felt less like calm and more like held breath. Ruth Ellery, the botanist, made a note in her own field log that was later added to the file by whoever assembled it. She wrote that the vegetation at the basin's shoreline was unusual, not in species, but in arrangement. Everything growing there grew away from the water rather than toward it. She had never seen that before in a freshwater environment. Plants orient toward water sources. That is what they do. These had oriented away from this one, and they had been doing it long enough that it had shaped the way the whole shoreline looked, leaning back, leaning away, every stem and leaf angled in the same direction, as if the entire bank had flinched and frozen in place. That evening at camp, Calloway asked Samuel directly why they had gone around the basin. He kept it professional. He framed it as a navigational question. He needed to log the reason for the deviation in his field notes, so he needed an explanation he could write down. Samuel looked at him for a moment, and Calloway records this pause in his personal letter to Dr. Hale, but not in the official report. Then Samuel said, and again this is in Cozy's transcription, "Still water here is not empty water. It is water that is paying attention." Calloway wrote that down. He logged it as a local navigational idiom of unclear practical origin. He moved on. He had data to collate and a schedule he was already behind on, and 12 other practical things competing for his attention. But Cozy writes that he watched Calloway's face when Samuel said it, and what he saw there was not dismissal. What he saw was a man carefully deciding not to ask the follow-up question. There is a difference between those two things. Calloway knew the difference better than anyone. The fact that he did not ask tells you something about what he already suspected. The decision to cross the basin did not happen until day 7, and it did not come from Calloway. One of the contractors, a man named Gary Hirsch, had been quietly frustrated for 2 days by what he called the long way round. He was not a man given to patience, and he was not being paid to understand local customs, and he made his opinion known at the morning briefing in the flat, practical language of a person who believes that the fastest line between 2 points is a straight one. Calloway listened. He looked at the map. He looked at the timeline. They were already a day and a half behind. He made a decision that he would spend the rest of his career not putting into writing, which is to say, he agreed. They would cross the basin. Samuel heard this and did not argue. And Cozy notes that clearly he did not argue, did not protest, did not repeat the warning from 2 evenings before. He just went and sat at the front of the lead boat and looked at the water, and did one thing that nobody commented on at the time, but that Cozy recorded carefully later. He kept one hand trailing in the water along the side of the hull. Not for any practical reason, just that one hand just below the surface, the whole time they crossed, like he was trying to feel something before it felt them. They crossed in about 12 minutes. The water was dark and still beneath them, and Calloway's sounding line could not find the bottom at any point across the central section. He records the depth as undetermined in his notes. What he does not record in his notes, but does describe in his letter to Dr. Hale, is that about halfway across, the engine sound changed. Not mechanically, the engine was fine, but the sound it made seemed to go nowhere, seemed to be absorbed rather than carried across the water the way sound normally travels in open air. He tapped the hull with his knuckle. He heard the knock, but it sounded close and flat, like tapping on a wall in a very small room. He did not mention this to anyone in the boat. He wrote it down that evening. He underlined it, and just below the underline he wrote 3 words that are not part of any professional survey notation. He wrote, "It felt witnessed." They reached the far bank. They continued into the next channel. Nothing came out of the water. Nothing surfaced. The engine sound went back to normal the moment they cleared the basin and re-entered the narrower channel ahead. Gary Hirsch said, "See, nothing to it," and 2 people laughed, because the tension needed somewhere to go. Samuel did not laugh. Samuel pulled his hand out of the water and dried it on his shirt and did not say anything at all. And Cozy, watching him from the second boat, noticed that Samuel looked at his own hand for a moment before he dried it. The way you might look at something you had been holding too close to a heat source. Not burned, not injured. Just checking. Just making sure. That night was the first night the camp felt different after dark. Gary Hirsch was gone the next morning. Not missing. Gone. His sleeping bag was folded. His boots were placed side by side next to it, perfectly aligned, toes pointing toward the water. His pack was still there. His jacket was still there. The mug he had used for coffee the night before was rinsed and set upside down on the flat rock he had been using as a table. Everything arranged. Everything in order. Like a man who had time to tidy up before he left. Or like something else entirely that I do not want to think about too carefully even now. Callaway's official report records Gary Hirsch as personnel who abandoned the survey site without authorization. That is the phrase he used. Abandoned without authorization. Because that is the only category the paperwork gave him. There was no category for what the campsite actually looked like that morning, which was not like a place a man had left, but like a place a man had been prepared to leave from. And Cozy's account goes further. He writes that when Samuel came out of his tent and saw the empty space where Hirsch had slept, he did not look surprised. He did not look relieved. He stood very still for a moment, the same quality of stillness as on the boat 2 days before. And then he walked to the water's edge and looked out toward the basin they had crossed. Not the near bank, the far bank, the direction they had come from. He stood there for a long time, and then, without turning around, without raising his voice, he said something in a language none of the others spoke. And Cozy writes that he recognized 2 words. He had heard them once before, from an elder in a village near the launch point, in a different context, in a different conversation, but the same 2 words. He translates them in his account as, "The introduction has been accepted." Nobody responded to that. There was nothing to respond to that with. Callaway wrote it down later, in his personal letter, not in the report. He wrote that he spent the rest of that morning trying to decide what it would mean if Samuel was right about what had happened, and that he had not been able to follow that line of thinking to any conclusion he was willing to record. The survey continued. What else were they going to do? They had a mandate and a budget and a team and most of a job still to finish, and absolutely no official framework for stopping and going home because a fisherman said something untranslatable at the edge of a lake. So they continued. But something had shifted in the texture of the days after that morning, and Callaway was precise enough to notice it, even if he could not name it in professional language. The contractors were quieter. Not frightened exactly, but contained, like men who had decided without discussing it that the amount of space they took up in this place should be smaller than it had been before. Ruth Ellery stopped taking her vegetation samples from the waterline and began collecting from further up the bank, 2 or 3 meters back from the edge, without explaining why. And Samuel rowed differently. Before Hirsch disappeared, he had been loose and efficient on the water, the movements of someone who has done this for years and trusts the environment completely. Now he rode with a particular tension in his shoulders, like a man carrying something fragile, like a man who knew that the difference between arrival and disaster was the quality of his own attention. Callaway noticed all of this. He recorded none of it in the official report. What he did record, in both the report and his personal letter, was the change in the water itself. And this is where I want you to pay close attention because this detail keeps coming back in all 3 documents. In Callaway's field notes, in Cozy's account, in Ruth Ellery's botanical log. each of them noticing it independently, and each of them describing it slightly differently, but arriving at the same basic observation. The water in the channels beyond the basin had a different quality than the water before it. Not in temperature, not in color, not in any measurable property that showed up in Callaway's instruments, but in the way it moved, or more precisely, in the way it did not move when it should have. Current that should have been predictable based on their charts and gradient calculations was absent in places it had no reason to be absent. Still patches appeared in mid-channel where the depth was consistent and the wind was steady, and there was no physical explanation for stillness. Callaway ran his standard measurements. He logged the anomalies as instrument-related irregularities, possible equipment degradation due to humidity exposure, pending further review. He was still trying to fit what he was experiencing into the forms he had been given. That is the thing about a rigorous professional mind. It is very good at protecting itself from the conclusions its own data is pointing toward. On day 9, Samuel began doing something that none of them could explain, and none of them asked him about directly, which tells you something about the atmosphere by that point. Every time they stopped the boats, every rest break, every meal stop, every time the engine cut out for any reason, he would reach down and keep one paddle moving in the water beside the hull, not steering, not correcting course, just moving, a slow, continuous circle just below the surface, keeping a faint displacement going around the boat at all times. Nkosi asked him about it quietly one afternoon while the others were eating. Samuel said without looking up from the water, "You do not let the surface settle completely when you are in this part of the channel." Nkosi asked why. Samuel said, "Because settled water here remembers what was in it, and it calls that back." Nkosi did not know what to do with that answer. He wrote it down exactly as Samuel said it, and then he wrote, "I believed him." Not because I understood what he meant, because of the way he said it. The way a person speaks when they are not trying to explain something, but simply telling you a fact of the place, the way you might tell someone the tide times or the wind direction. Information, not story. That night, Callaway sat up after everyone else had gone to sleep, and he listened to the channel in the dark. He wrote about this in his letter to Dr. Hale. He wrote that the water made no sound at all for most of an hour, which he knew was physically unusual for a moving channel system, even a slow one. And then, just once, at a point he could not locate precisely because it seemed to come from below rather than from any direction, there was a sound. He described it as a pressure shift rather than a noise, like the moment a large volume of water changes depth quickly but without any surface disturbance to show for it, like something very large adjusting its position in a space that should not have been large enough to contain it. He sat with that sound for a long time. Then he wrote it down. Then he closed the notebook and did not sleep. The capsize happened the next afternoon, and that is when everything Callaway had been very carefully not saying out loud became impossible to avoid. The boat did not hit anything. That is the part that stays with me. There was no submerged rock, no sudden current, no mechanical failure, no wave from a passing vessel because there were no other vessels on that channel for miles in any direction. The lead boat simply went over. One moment it was upright and moving at a steady pace through a narrow section of channel that Callaway had personally assessed as low risk based on depth readings taken 20 minutes earlier. The next moment, it was sideways in the water, and Callaway and Nkosi were underneath it in the dark. Nkosi describes the water as cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He means something specific by that, and he works to explain it in his account. The channel water up to that point had been warm, consistently warm, the kind of warmth you expect from a shallow, slow-moving system in a hot climate. The water he went into when the boat capsized was different, not dramatically colder in the way a thermometer would register it, but cold in the way a room gets cold when something changes in it that has nothing to do with the air. He says it felt intentional. He crossed out that word in his account and wrote it again. Intentional. Calloway was underwater for what he estimates in his letter as somewhere between 15 and 20 seconds before he got clear of the hull and surfaced. Those seconds are the center of everything, because what he describes seeing beneath the surface of that channel is not something that fits inside any category I have found in any scientific record, and I have looked. I have looked carefully. What he describes in the private letter he wrote to Dr. Hale and never sent is not a shape exactly. He is very precise about this distinction. He writes that the word shape implies defined edges, and he could not locate defined edges. What he could locate was a presence of displacement, meaning something was occupying the space below him the way a continent occupies space, not by having a clear outline, but by simply being what everything else is arranged around. He writes that it was darker than the water around it, despite the water being dark. He writes that it did not move in response to him. It did not accelerate toward him or away from him. It simply held its position in a way that communicated, and this is his word, sufficiency. Like a thing that has never in its existence needed to hurry toward anything or away from anything, because the question of whether it was safe had simply never been relevant to it. He surfaced. He grabbed the hull. He pulled himself up. And Cozy was already on the far bank, soaked through, eyes wide, breathing hard. The second boat, carrying Samuel and two of the contractors, had pulled to a stop about 30 meters back. Samuel had not come forward. He had stopped the engine, and he was sitting very still in the bow, looking at the water between his boat and where Calloway was clinging to the capsized hull. Not looking at Calloway, looking at the water between them. And Calloway writes that he understood in that moment, without any words being exchanged, that Samuel was watching to see what the water did next, that he was reading something in the surface that the rest of them did not have the vocabulary to read. The hull was eventually righted, everyone was accounted for, and every single waterproof survey case that had been loaded onto the lead boat was gone, all of them. The depth charts, the vegetation maps, the channel documentation from 9 days of work, the navigational overlays they had been building day by day to fill in the gaps in the official maps. Gone. Settled somewhere in that channel, in water with no recorded bottom depth, with something in it that Calloway had seen with his own eyes and could not name, and would spend the rest of his career carefully not discussing in any room with more than one other person in it. The basin they had crossed on day 7 had no name on any map before the expedition. It would have been named in the final survey documentation. That documentation was now at the bottom of a channel. The basin remains nameless on every official chart produced by that agency before or since. That is not an accident of bureaucracy. That is what happens when the only record that would have named a place goes into the water with whatever is living in it. That night, camp was the quietest Nkosi had ever experienced in the field. Not because people were asleep, because people were awake and choosing not to make sound. He writes that the three remaining contractors sat together and spoke in voices so low he could not distinguish words from where he sat 6 feet away. Ruth Ellery wrote in her field log for that day, and the entry is a single line. She wrote, "I do not think the capsize was random." And then she stopped writing and did not add to the log again until they were 2 days from the launch point on the way back out. Calloway sat apart from the group that night. He had a lamp and his notebook, and he sat with both for a long time, writing nothing. Cozy watched him from across the camp. He writes that at one point, Calloway put the pen down and just sat looking at the water. Not with the focused professional attention of a man taking field observations, with the particular quality of stillness that Cozy had first seen in Samuel on the morning they launched. The stillness of a man who is no longer certain what the thing he is looking at is actually doing back. In the morning, Calloway made the decision to pull back toward the launch point. He framed it in his official report as a professional withdrawal following equipment loss, rendering survey completion impractical under prevailing conditions. In his letter to Dr. Hale, he does not mention the decision at all. He skips directly from the capsize to what happened on the final night before they left. And what happened on that final night is the part of the file that I read 3 times in that basement before I was willing to accept that a man like Calloway had actually written it down. Because on that final night, Calloway did not stay in camp. He walked to the water alone at 2 in the morning, and he did not tell anyone where he was going. This is not in the official report. Nothing about that final night is in the official report. It exists only in the private letter to Dr. Hale. 3 paragraphs written in a hand that Calloway's daughter later described to the archivist as different from his usual writing, tighter, closer together, like a man writing in a small space, even when the page was open in front of him. I think about that detail more than I probably should. He writes that he could not sleep, and that the reason he could not sleep was a sound. Not the pressure shift he had described from 2 nights before, something different, something that came and went at irregular intervals. A low resonance that he felt more in the sternum than heard with the ears, the way you feel a truck pass on a road you cannot see. It came from the direction of the water. It was not an animal sound he recognized. It was not mechanical. It had no rhythm he could identify, and yet it did not feel random. He writes, "It felt like a language I was never going to understand, but could tell was being spoken directly at me." He got up. He walked to the bank. And this is where I need you to understand something about James Calloway before I tell you what he writes next. This is a man who spent 2 decades making decisions based on evidence. A man whose entire professional identity was built on the discipline of not going further than the data warranted. That man walked to the edge of that water alone in the dark and stood there, and something came to the surface. He does not describe a shape. He has already established in the letter, when writing about the capsize, that shape is not quite the right category. What he describes this time is a displacement of the surface across a wide area of the channel, a slow rise, not breaking the water, but lifting it the way a very large breath lifts a chest. He estimates the affected area as roughly the width of the channel, and perhaps 20 meters in length, though he writes that he is not confident in that estimate because his ability to judge distance in the dark was affected by something he cannot name precisely. A kind of difficulty in locating his own edges in relation to what was in front of him. Like the space between him and the water had changed its properties without moving. He stood there. He did not move. And then he writes something that I had to read twice before I understood what he was actually saying. He writes that he became aware that the thing in the water was not facing him in the way an animal faces something. It was oriented toward him. There is a difference. An animal faces something with a front and a back, with eyes that point in one direction. What Calloway describes is orientation, the way a field orients toward a source of gravity. The whole of it, whatever it was, adjusting its attention in his direction without having a direction in the normal sense. He writes, I had the clear and specific sensation of being the smallest thing in a very large room, and of the room becoming aware that I was in it. He looked directly at it. He writes that he knew, based on everything Samuel had told them across nearly 3 weeks on those channels, that this was exactly what you were not supposed to do. And he looked anyway. He calls it, in the letter, a failure of instinct. Not professional instinct, older instinct, the kind that has nothing to do with training. He looked because he is a man who spent his entire career believing that looking carefully at things was the correct response to them. He looked, and then he writes, simply, without elaboration, that it looked back. He does not describe what that felt like. He moves immediately to the next sentence, which is about walking back to camp, about getting into his sleeping bag without waking anyone, about lying in the dark until morning came. The absence of description in that gap is louder than anything else in the 3 pages. A man who described the texture of water and the quality of silence and the precise dimensions of a channel bank could not find words for what happened when it looked back at him. Or chose not to. The letter does not tell us which. In the morning they left, and Cozy's account of the departure occupies less space than any other entry in his 4 pages. He writes that they loaded the remaining equipment in silence, that Samuel started the engine without being asked, and that as they pulled away from the bank and back into the narrow channel heading toward the launch point, he looked back once. He does not describe what he saw when he looked back. He writes only that Samuel, sitting directly behind him, put one hand briefly on his shoulder and said, "Do not do that again." And Cozy writes that he understood immediately what Samuel meant, even though no explanation was given. You did not look back at that place, not because it was superstition, because looking back was an acknowledgement, and acknowledgement, in whatever logic governed that stretch of water, meant something he was not prepared to find out. Calloway's official report describes the departure as a professional withdrawal following equipment loss, rendering survey completion impractical. 5 words to sum up 22 days. 5 words to account for Gary Hirsch, for the capsize, for the basin with no name, for the thing that Calloway had looked at directly in the dark, and that had looked back. 5 words and then a section on recommendations for future survey methodology in that region, which includes, buried in the 3rd paragraph, a single line that reads, "Local navigational guidance should be weighted more heavily in expedition planning for this channel system, and certain seasonal and environmental factors identified during this survey warrant further review before future teams are deployed." That is all. That is the entire official acknowledgement of what happened out there. 1 sentence wrapped in professional language, pointing at something enormous and naming it further review. The full unrevised report, the 8 pages Calloway actually wrote before his department head asked him to revise it, tells a different story. And the fact that it survived at all that it was sitting in that box in the archive basement next to the revised version is something I keep coming back to. Because someone kept it. Someone made the decision to retain the original alongside the sanitized copy, to seal both together, to wrap them separately in brown paper and label them and put them somewhere that was technically accessible but practically invisible. That decision required deliberate effort. It was not negligence. It was not an oversight. Someone wanted both versions to exist. Someone wanted the gap between them to be preserved. The question I cannot answer, the question the file itself cannot answer, is whether that someone was trying to protect the truth or protect themselves from having destroyed it. What I found next, when I went looking for context beyond the file itself, I was not prepared for. The department head who told Calloway to revise his report died 2 years after receiving it, and among his personal effects was a handwritten note that his family assumed was meaningless and nearly threw away. It was not meaningless. It was a copy, in the department head's own handwriting, of the single most disturbing paragraph in Calloway's original, unrevised submission. The paragraph describing what was beneath the water during the capsize. He had copied it out by hand, word for word, on a piece of personal stationery, folded it in half, and kept it in the inside pocket of a jacket that had not been worn in over a year. His family donated the jacket to a second-hand sale. The note was found by whoever bought it. That note eventually found its way into the same archive as the file, attached with a paperclip and a typed index card that simply reads, "Related item, provenance unclear." Someone understood that it belonged with the rest of this. Someone made sure it got there. I found the note on my third visit to the archive, 3 weeks after finding the original box. By that point, I had read the 3 documents so many times that I had stopped seeing them as documents and started seeing them as a room I was spending too much time inside. The department head had underlined 2 words in his handwritten copy, the same 2 words Calloway had used in his personal letter to Dr. Hale, words that appeared in neither the official report nor the revised submission. The 2 words were prior and sufficient. Prior, meaning before any category you have for old things. Sufficient, meaning a thing so complete in itself that your presence or absence changes nothing about what it is. The department head had underlined those 2 words, and then beneath them he had written 3 of his own, in a hand noticeably less steady than the rest of the copy. He wrote, "I believe him. That note is what changed the shape of everything for me, because it tells you something the file alone cannot tell you. It tells you that the man who received Calloway's original report, the man who then asked him to remove everything unverifiable from it, did not do that because he thought Calloway was wrong. He did it because Calloway was right. And the system he administered had no place for what right meant in this particular case. He protected the institution from the information. Then he copied the information out by hand and kept it close to his body for the rest of his life. That is not the behavior of a man who dismissed what he read. That is the behavior of a man who could not stop thinking about it and had no one to talk to about it. Calloway submitted the revised report. His original went into the box. 2 years passed, and then something happened that I did not find in the archive at all, but tracked down through a separate search of academic institutional records. Calloway contacted Dr. Margaret Hale, not by letter, which is what we might have expected, given the unsent letter found in his field jacket lining. He contacted her in person. He traveled to the Natural History Institution where she worked and requested a meeting. The meeting lasted, according to the institution's visitor log, just under 2 hours. There is no record of what was discussed. Dr. Hale's professional correspondence from that period contains no reference to the meeting and no reference to Calloway by name. But in her published research from the following year, a survey of documented behavioral anomalies in large freshwater systems, there is a footnote in the 3rd chapter. The footnote reads, "Certain field accounts described to the author privately suggest the behavioral range of unknown freshwater organisms may extend significantly beyond current modeling assumptions. The accounts cannot be cited directly, as the sources have requested confidentiality. This footnote does not appear in the 2nd edition of the same work, published 5 years later. It was removed without explanation. Someone asked her to remove it, or she decided on her own that it was safer not to have it there. Either way, it was there once." She believed him, too. What I am telling you is that every single person who got close enough to this material to understand it came away changed by it. Not frightened exactly, or not only frightened. Changed in the specific way that happens when a foundational assumption turns out to have been wrong all along. When the framework you built everything else on top of quietly reveals a crack that cannot be unseen. Calloway understood something in that channel system that his entire career had not prepared him for. His department head understood it secondhand from a paragraph. Dr. Hale understood it from a 2-hour conversation in a room with no record of its contents. And I understand it now from a box in a basement, from brown paper packages and a typed field report, and a letter that traveled further, folded inside a jacket lining, than it ever would have traveled through the post. The thing in that basin does not need anyone to believe in it. It does not require documentation. It does not require a name on a map, or a classification in a scientific catalog, or a footnote in an academic survey that later gets quietly removed. It was there before the maps existed. It will be there after the institution that commissioned those maps has been reorganized or defunded or simply forgotten. The communities who live along that watershed know this in a way that needs no file and no footnote, because they never made the mistake of thinking their understanding of the place was the same thing as the place itself. Calloway made that mistake. He spent his career building precise and careful maps of the world, and at some point began to confuse the map for the territory. What the channel system gave him, at significant cost, was the correction. He came back knowing that the territory is always larger than any map made of it, and that some of what lives in the unmapped parts has been there long enough that it does not notice the maps at all. He never went back. Not to that region, not to field survey work of any kind. And what he did next, the professional choice he made in the 2 years following the expedition, is the part of this story that I find most quietly devastating of all. Calloway spent the last 2 decades of his working life cataloging other people's discoveries, and I think he chose that deliberately. He transferred out of active field survey work within 2 years of the expedition and took a position in the same agency's records division, a desk job involving the classification and indexing of environmental survey data from across the country. He reviewed other teams' fieldwork. He organized their findings into official categories. He decided what got filed where and under what designation, and with what level of access restriction. His colleagues from that period describe him in consistent terms across several institutional memory documents I found in a separate archive search. Thorough, quiet, exceptionally good at identifying which data sets needed more careful handling. That last detail appears in 3 separate descriptions from 3 separate colleagues, all using almost identical language, as if it were something people noticed about him and talked about among themselves. Exceptionally good at identifying which data sets needed more careful handling. I do not think that was a coincidence of phrasing. I think those colleagues were describing, without understanding what they were describing, a man who had developed a very specific sensitivity to the kind of information that institutions are not equipped to process honestly. He knew what that looked like now. He had submitted it himself once. He had watched what happened to it. The position he took gave him something that I think he needed more than anything else after the expedition, which was the ability to ensure that certain things were preserved, even when the system around them was working to make them disappear. He had access to original submissions before revision. He had authority over classification decisions. He had the kind of quiet institutional power that nobody outside the building would ever notice or think to question. And I believe, though the file cannot prove this, that it was Calloway himself who made the decision to keep the original unrevised report alongside the sanitized version in that sealed box. That it was Calloway who wrapped each document in brown paper and labeled them with a typewriter, and put them somewhere technically accessible but practically invisible. Not to protect himself, not to make the truth available in any immediate sense, but because he could not bring himself to let it disappear entirely, and this was the only form of honesty the system left him room for. That is a particular kind of sadness. To know something true and have no legitimate channel for it. To construct a small, careful hiding place for the evidence of your own experience, because the institution you work inside has made the honest version of reality into a liability. He spent 20 years doing that job, reviewing other people's data, flagging what needed careful handling, making sure certain things got preserved in forms that could theoretically be found by someone who knew to look. And then he retired, and then he went home, and then he was quiet for the rest of his life, in a way that his daughter, in the note attached to his donated papers, describes as not unhappy exactly, but very contained. Like a man who had decided that most conversations were not worth the energy of having them. He made one attempt during those 20 years to have the original unrevised report reinstated in the official record. One formal request, submitted through proper channels, asking that the classification be reviewed and the original submission restored as the primary document. The request was denied. No reason was recorded. He did not appeal. He did not submit a second request. He simply went back to his desk and continued doing what he had been doing, and the file stayed sealed, and his career continued in its quiet, thorough way until it ended. And that was that. A man who once stood at the edge of a remote channel in the dark and looked directly at something that had no category in any scientific framework, reduced by the logic of institutions to a man who organized other people's paperwork and said nothing about what he knew for the rest of his professional life. His daughter's name was Claire. She is mentioned only once in the archival documentation, in the provenance note attached to the donated papers. She did not know what was in the box. She knew her father had worked in environmental survey and records for his entire career, and that he had done one field expedition early on that he never discussed. She knew he kept a locked drawer in his home office that he had never opened in front of her. When he passed, that drawer contained the field jacket, still folded, with a letter still in the lining, along with a single photograph she did not recognize. The photograph shows a stretch of open water, very still, taken from what appears to be a boat. The image is slightly overexposed, the way photographs get when there is too much light on a reflective surface. There is nothing in the photograph that looks unusual. There is nothing in it that would tell you, looking at it cold, why a man kept it locked in a private drawer for 30 years. Claire donated it, along with everything else, because she thought it might be historically relevant. She had no idea how right she was. The photograph is in the file. It is the last item in the box, not listed in any index, not wrapped in brown paper, just loose at the bottom under everything else. I held it in my hands in that basement under the buzzing fluorescent light and looked at it for a long time. Still water, overexposed sky, the bow of a boat just visible at the lower left edge of the frame. And in the center of the image, in the part of the water that should have been brightest because of the light angle, a section of surface that is darker than the water around it. Not a shadow. The light is coming from the wrong direction for a shadow. Just darker, dense, occupying the center of the frame the way something very large occupies space when it is just below a surface and not quite breaking it. Calloway took that photograph. He kept it for 30 years. He never showed it to anyone, never sent it to Dr. Hale alongside the letter he never posted, never submitted it with the formal request to reinstate the original report. He kept it in a locked drawer, and he looked at it in private, and I do not know what he thought when he looked at it, but I know what I thought when I looked at it in that basement. I thought, that thing in the water is still there. And then I thought about Emma Doyle. Emma Doyle had documented the protocols years before Calloway ever set foot in a boat on that channel system, and nobody had connected the two until I sat on that basement floor with both documents in my hands at the same time. Her dissertation was not obscure exactly, but it was the kind of academic work that lands in a specific institutional library and stays there, cited occasionally in footnotes by researchers working in adjacent fields, never pulling enough general attention to travel far beyond the shelves it was placed on. I found a reference to it in a regional environmental anthropology index while I was searching for any academic work that touched on the watershed communities near the survey area. The index listed it by author and title and gave a shelf location in a different archive entirely, one I had to request access to separately, which took 3 weeks and 2 follow-up emails, and a phone call to a librarian named Peter, who turned out to be the only person in that building who knew where the relevant collection actually was. 3 weeks to find a document that would have changed everything for Calloway if he had found it first. 3 weeks that, for him, would have meant the difference between walking into that channel system with open eyes and walking into it the way he actually did, which was with the comfortable, professional confidence of a man who believed his instruments could measure whatever was there to be measured. Doyle had spent 18 months living and working alongside the fishing communities in the watershed region, documenting their relationship with the channel system in the kind of careful ethnographic detail that takes years to produce and gets read by dozens of people at most. Her dissertation covers seasonal fishing practices, water management knowledge, oral traditions related to the geography, and what she calls behavioral ecology, meaning the specific ways the communities organized their activity around the natural environment in ways that reflected generations of accumulated knowledge about how that environment actually behaved. Most of it is exactly what it sounds like: careful, specific, quietly remarkable in the way that genuine fieldwork usually is, but not the kind of thing that makes you put the page down and sit very still for a moment. The 3rd chapter does that. She devotes roughly 30 pages to what the communities describe as the protocols of the still water season. She is careful in her framing, appropriately academic, noting that she is documenting observed practice and reported tradition without making claims about the underlying beliefs that inform them. But the practices themselves are specific enough that the documentation reads less like anthropology and more like an instruction manual written by people who have tested every item in it against hard experience. No anchoring in the wide basin sections of the Western Channel during the months following heavy rainfall. No engine noise after dark in those areas during the same period. No solo navigation in the basin sections under any circumstances at any time of year. And the fourth protocol, the one Doyle flags with a translator's note acknowledging that her rendering is imprecise, is the one that stopped me completely when I read it, against everything I knew by then about what happened to Calloway on that final night. The fourth protocol states that if the thing in the water shows itself, you do not meet its attention. Doyle's translator's note reads as follows. The verb used here does not precisely mean look at or make eye contact. It carries a meaning closer to respond to or acknowledge as present. The elder who explained this protocol to her said, in Doyle's translation, that to meet its attention is to step across a threshold you did not know was there. And once you are across it, the terms of where you are belong to the thing that made the threshold, not to you. Calloway crossed that threshold on the final night. He wrote about it in a letter he never sent. He described it as a failure of instinct, a professional reflex. He spent the rest of his life in a locked room of his own making, reviewing other people's data, keeping a photograph in a locked drawer, saying nothing to anyone. And Doyle had written down, years before any of it happened, exactly why that was the cost of what he did. Not as a warning, as a description of a fact the community had already verified, at some point far enough in the past that nobody alive could remember when the protocol was established, or what specific event had made it necessary. It had simply always been the rule, because the rule had always been necessary. I sat with Doyle's dissertation and Calloway's file in my lap for a long time in that archive, in a room that smelled like old paper and the particular silence of a place where very few people come to ask questions. And I kept thinking about the gap between these two documents. Doyle's work existed. It was in an archive. It was accessible to anyone with a research purpose and enough patience to track down the right librarian. Calloway's agency commissioned the survey of that exact watershed region. Someone in that agency, presumably, did at least a basic literature review of existing research on the area before sending 8 people into it, with 12 days of supplies and an equipment list that made no provision whatsoever for the possibility that some of what was in that channel system was not going to show up on a depth meter. Nobody found Doyle's dissertation. Or if they did, nobody flagged it as relevant. Or if they flagged it, nobody acted on it. Or if someone acted on it, that action has not survived in any record I have been able to locate. The gap between what was known and what was used is where Gary Hirsch disappears. It is where Calloway's maps go into the water. It is where a sealed box ends up in a basement for decades with a strip of tape across the lid and 2 words written in fading marker. Doyle is still alive. I found that out on my 4th visit to the archive from Peter the librarian, who had by that point become genuinely interested in what I was researching and had started pulling related materials without being asked. She retired from academic work some years ago. She lives quietly. She gave one interview in the early years of her retirement to a small environmental journal, discussing her field work in general terms. The interviewer asked whether she had ever gone back to the watershed communities she had documented. There was a pause in the transcript before her answer, long enough that the interviewer noted it. Then she said, "I went back once, about a year after the dissertation. I stayed for 2 weeks, and I came back knowing that I had been right about everything I wrote," which was not as satisfying as it sounds, because being right about that particular thing mostly just means understanding what you are not going to do and why. The interviewer did not follow up on that answer. I would have followed up on that answer. I tried to contact her. Emma Doyle never responded to my first message, or my second. The third one I sent through the university that had originally published her dissertation, routed through their alumni contact system, which felt vaguely desperate even as I was doing it. That one got a response. 11 days later, 2 sentences, no greeting, no signature. It said, "I am aware of the file you are describing. I would ask that you consider carefully what you intend to do with it before you do anything at all." I read those 2 sentences probably 20 times, not because they were difficult to understand, because of everything compressed inside them. She did not ask how I had found the file. She did not ask what was in it, which means she already knew, which means she had either seen it herself at some point or had been told about it by someone who had. She did not say, "Do not publish this," or "You are making a mistake," or any of the things a person says when they want to stop you from doing something. She said, "Consider carefully," which is the thing you say when you believe the person in front of you is capable of making a reasonable decision, but you want to make sure they understand the weight of what they are holding before they decide what to do with it. I wrote back the same day. I told her I had read her dissertation. I told her about the 4th protocol and about Calloway's final night at the water, and about the specific language he used in his letter. The word threshold, the phrase, "terms that are not yours to set." I told her I thought those 2 documents were describing the same event from opposite directions, one from the inside and one from the outside, and that together they formed something more complete than either one alone. I told her I thought people should know about this. I told her I was not sure what knowing about it would do for anyone, but I believed the alternative, which was putting the file back in the box and the box back on the shelf and walking away, was not something I was able to do. Her response this time took 3 days. It was longer. 4 paragraphs. I am not going to quote it directly because she did not give me permission to do that, and that matters to me. But I will tell you what it said in the way she said it, which was careful and honest, and without any of the hostility I had half expected. She confirmed that she had encountered the file, not in the archive where I found it, in a different archive in a different city, a partial copy that had been forwarded by someone in the original agency during the period when Calloway was working in the records division. She believed Calloway had sent it himself. She did not know why he had sent it to that particular location, or how he had known to send it to someone who would understand what it meant. But she believed it was intentional, that it was Calloway's way of making sure the information existed in more than one place. The same logic that had produced the sealed box extended outward one more step. She told me she had gone back to the watershed communities after reading the partial copy. Not the full file, just the partial copy, which was enough. She had spent 2 weeks with the same community elders she had worked with during her original research, and she had asked them, carefully, about the period of the survey expedition, about whether anything had changed in the channel system around that time or after it. The elders had been quiet for a while before answering. Then one of them, A woman who had been a young adult during the time of the expedition said something that Doyle transcribed in her notes and shared with me in her letter. The woman said something was introduced to it that season that it had not had before. We do not know what the introduction was, but we noticed the change. The protocols became more careful after that, more specific, like rules that had been general before, and then became particular because a particular thing had happened. Doyle wrote to me that she did not know what to do with that information when she received it, and she still did not know years later. She had chosen not to include it in any published work. She had chosen not to contact the agency or any academic institution with it. She had chosen, like Calloway before her and his department head before him, to keep it close and say nothing and live with the weight of it in a private way. She said she did not think that was necessarily the right choice. She said she was not sure there was a right choice. She said, and this is the part of her letter I keep coming back to, that the thing about an encounter with something genuinely outside your framework is that it does not give you a new framework. It just removes the old one. And you have to decide, in the space where the old one used to be, how to keep functioning as a person in a world that still mostly operates on the assumption that the framework is intact. That is what happened to Calloway. That is what the locked drawer was for. That is why a man who spent his whole career moving toward things, measuring them, documenting them, building maps of what existed, ended the same career moving in the opposite direction, indexing other people's discoveries, making sure certain things were preserved but not amplified, living inside a choice he had made without quite realizing he was making it. He was functioning in the space where the old framework used to be. He was doing the best he could with what the channel system had left him with, which was the knowledge that some things exist entirely outside the space where your tools work. And the most honest thing you can do with that knowledge is not pretend the tools still reach. I put the file back in the box. I put the box back on the shelf in the archive basement. I took photographs of every document first, every page of Calloway's field report, every page of Nkozi's account, every page of the unsent letter, the department head's handwritten note, Claire's provenance note, and the photograph of the still water with the dark center. I put all of those photographs on a drive that I keep in a drawer in my own home, not locked. I thought about locking it. I decided that Calloway had already tried that approach, and I did not think it had served him particularly well. The basin at the center of the channel system has no official name. The survey that would have named it is at the bottom of the water with whatever is down there. The communities along that watershed still observe the protocols, the same ones Doyle documented, the same ones that predate the survey, the same ones that will still be observed long after this recording and everything connected to it has been forgotten. They do not observe them because a government file says to. They observe them because the reason for them has not changed. Something is in that water. It was there before anyone came to measure it. It is there now. It does not need a name in any scientific catalog to know exactly what it is and where it begins and where, for everything else, the terms of engagement are set by whatever it is, and not by whoever is doing the approaching. Calloway looked at it directly. He crossed the threshold Samuel had described without knowing it was a threshold. He spent the rest of his life in the space between what he had seen and what he could say about it. That space is a real place. It is the place where this file lives, where Doyle's unpublished notes live, where the department head's copied paragraph lived in an inside jacket pocket for years. It is the place where you end up when you encounter something true that the world you live in does not have room for yet. Here's what all of this, taken together, actually means. The world contains things that have been here longer than our ability to categorize them. And our systems, our institutions, our frameworks, our maps, they are not tools for finding those things. They are tools for managing the space between us and those things. The communities who live closest to that water never confused those two functions. Calloway spent a career confusing them, and then one night on a dark channel bank, he stopped being confused. And the cost of that clarity was everything he had built his sense of himself on. The question is not whether something is in that water. The question is what you are willing to give up in order to see it clearly. And that brings me to something I want to ask you directly. Because you have listened to all of this, you have followed every document, every decision, every choice these people made when they found themselves in contact with something their frameworks could not hold. And I want to know where you actually land on this. Not what you think you are supposed to say, not the safe answer, the real one. If you had been Calloway, standing at the edge of that water in the dark, with everything you had built your life on, telling you that what you were seeing could not exist, and you felt it orient toward you, and you knew the protocol, and you knew the cost of breaking it, what would you have done? Would you have looked away? Or would you have looked directly the way he did and accepted whatever came with that? Tell me in the comments. I mean it. I read every single one. If this story found you the way it found me, leave a like and subscribe. There are more files. The archive does not run out, and some of what is still in it is waiting for someone to open the right box.